The history of Iraq has been written in blood. Ancient kings leading the world's first armies were interested in one thing only: total domination. And their cities and empires, the earliest on Earth, emerged and fell through warfare, invasion, and conquest.
That is one age of terror that you don't want to live through.
Through the centuries, this hotspot, in many ways world history's ground zero, was also subjected to violence from foreign raiders.
They turned around and basically butchered the chariot crews with spears and axes from behind.
In the modern era, Iraq became a stage for European imperialism, and more recently, a focal point in American foreign policy.
This truly must be one of the most horrendous, oppressive regimes in history, even compared with the fascists of Europe.
From Sargon the Great to Saddam Hussein, this is The Kings, from Babylon to Baghdad. Mesopotamia. The Greek word for ancient Iraq means the land between the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. The Mesopotamian plain, part of the Fertile Crescent, was a perfect environment with abundant water for civilization to flourish. An advanced tribal culture developed in this region long before Egypt, Greece, and Rome. Tribes turned into settlements, settlements into towns. By 3500 BC, the world's very first cities, Uruk and Ur, rose in southern Mesopotamia, a region also known as Sumer.
It's the place that saw the development for the first time on the planet Earth of virtually all of those social and political and technological things that we associate with civilized life. The world's earliest writing systems developed in Mesopotamia. The world's first kings, the invention of the wheel, the invention of the plow, the development of the state as a way of organizing political life.
By 2900 BC, the patchwork of Mesopotamia's 30 or so city-states hardly comprised a cohesive empire. Each had its own king, its own patron god or goddess, and a competing area of agricultural fields. Rival cities created alliances to bolster their own independence or to conquer their neighbors.
Distances between these cities were actually quite small, and because the irrigation land was so valuable, these cities were constantly at war with one another for the smallest of advantages.
By 2334 BC, one king came to dominate Mesopotamia: Sargon the Great.
As far as we know, there are no images of Sargon that survive. But we can guess what he would have looked like. He would have looked, at least in his portraits, the way that Mesopotamian kings tended to look, which was powerful, strong.
The ancient form of Sargon's name, Sharu-Keen, means the legitimate king. A strong hint, scholars say, that he was a usurper. In a Moses-like legend about his origins, Sargon was the illegitimate son of a priestess.
So she put him in a basket after he was born and floated him in the river, and the basket then was discovered by a gardener who raised him, and then he went into the service of the king of Kish.
Enterprising, ambitious, and ruthless, Sargon overthrew King Zababa of Kish and declared himself the city's new ruler. He also reigned at Agaday, the capital city he built north of Sumer in the state of Akkad, though its precise location is still unknown. With his Akkadian army, Sargon started to take control of southern Mesopotamia. His first conquest was the city of Uruk, where he captured and then humiliated Uruk's king, Lugalza-Gezi, by dragging him away on a leash.
And then after he conquered Uruk, he conquered other southern Mesopotamian cities, and then he seems to have thought, for whatever reason, I can keep going. He wasn't content simply, as the earlier Sumerian kings had been, to fight local battles. He wanted to take over what was then the known world.
Remarkably, he did just that. Over a 56-year reign, Sargon conquered North Mesopotamia, North Syria, and eventually reached the Mediterranean to capture southeast Turkey. Sargon built the world's first empire.
He's the first king in the world to decide to take over lands that were occupied by people of different nationalities, different languages, different gods. And he was somebody that Mesopotamian kings from that time onwards looked up to. He was the king that really set the ground rules for what it was to be an emperor.
Sargon's empire was not only unique in scale, but also in organization.
He tried to unify this vast area and reorganize it in a way that it had never been done before. Every city in Mesopotamia had its own system of weights and measures. Sargon standardized weights and measures throughout the whole area he had conquered. And by doing that, he made it possible to have trade over vast distances.
Sargon's novel ideas weren't limited to empire building, but extended to the military as well. He was the first king who claimed to have a standing army. Drafted from all cities in the empire, it was a huge force of 5,400 men that proved expensive to maintain. So Sargon instituted a new tradition to help feed his troops: plundering.
They fed themselves, the army, from the land there, so that the campaigns were more or less set to go at the point when the harvest was completed throughout Mesopotamia. That is one age of terror that you don't want to live through. Being outside of Akkad and not a member of that inner elite, and knowing that every year you are going to be faced with this kind of slaughter.
Sargon reigned until his death in 2279 BC. His dynasty continued to rule for another 82 years. Yet, as imposing as the Akkadian Empire was, it also proved fragile. In 2197 BC, the kingdom fell to raiders from the Zagros Mountains in Persia. Soon, a new king will emerge. Using Sargon as his role model, Hammurabi would single-handedly create a legendary city.
And all of a sudden, he's turning up on the borders with his army ready to fight.
You are watching The Kings from Babylon to Baghdad, here on the History Channel. In 2197 BC, chaos followed the fall of the Akkadian Empire that originated with Sargon. Finally, in 2112, the kings of Ur restored stability. Then, a new threat appeared from the northwest. A nomadic people called Amorites terrified the Mesopotamians.
They saw the Amorites as barbarians. Their descriptions of them, these are people who don't farm, they don't live in houses, they live in tents. They don't bury their dead on the day that they died. They don't cook their meat.
But rather than causing turmoil, by 1900 BC, the Amorites had completely assimilated into Mesopotamian life. They became soldiers, farmers, and businessmen, and rose to the ranks of governor and general. They consolidated their hold on Mesopotamia by founding dynasties in the cities of Isin, Larsa, Eshnunna, and Babylon.
It turned out to be actually a good thing for Mesopotamia in the end that the Amorites came, because some of the greatest Mesopotamian kings were Amorites.
In 1792 BC, the greatest ruler of Babylon's Amorite dynasty, Hammurabi, came to the throne as its sixth king. Initially, he didn't seem to be interested in military campaigns.
He ruled for 43 years. And starting in his 30th year, he gets it into his head to emulate Sargon, to build himself an empire. He starts campaigning against the neighboring kingdoms. And these are neighboring kingdoms that had previously been allies. These are some of them he had long-standing relationships with. And all of a sudden he's turning up on the borders with his army ready to fight, ready to take them over.
Hammurabi's military campaigns were distinguished by the growing popularity of hostage-taking for ransom.
There were merchants who specialized in this, who would go and ransom the Babylonian soldiers from the enemy. They would pay the ransom, and then they were required to be paid back. So a win-win situation for the merchant, because they would make a profit off these ransoms that they were paying.
Hammurabi's conquests extended from the Persian Gulf to Syria. Although his empire wasn't as big as Sargon's had been, scholars rate Hammurabi as the greatest empire builder since Sargon. However, he set himself apart from the former king.
Whereas Sargon seems to have relied upon his power and his almost terror tactics to keep people under control, Hammurabi presents himself almost like a modern politician in that he wants to be loved. He wants the people to like him. He's going to set up laws that will protect them, not laws that will terrify them and force them into submission.
Hammurabi's fame grew from his conquests, but his greatness came from his concern with justice. Toward the end of his reign, he erected several monuments in his cities. The largest one to remain intact is a stone slab known today as the Hammurabi Stele, a collection of 282 legal verdicts. They're written in a wedge-shaped script called cuneiform, the earliest known writing, developed in Sumer at the end of the 4th millennium.
If a slave says to the master, "You are not my master," the master shall cut off the slave's ear. If a man brings an accusation of murder against another man without providing proof, the accuser shall be put to death. If a woman is not discreet, but a gadabout, thus neglecting her house and discrediting her husband, They shall throw this woman in the water.
Hammurabi's plan for administering justice was extensive. His civil and criminal regulations covered many subjects, including commercial, family, and property law, prices and wages, and slavery regulations and fees.
Some of them seem very sensible to us. Hammurabi's, the court spends a lot of time on specifying the social position of a married woman, when she's at fault for doing something, when she's not, what her property rights are. Laws that seem very, very advanced to us nowadays and very much not unexpected. On the other hand, what we find in the Hammurabi Code is the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth passages that totally parallel the biblical notion of that.
Hammurabi's justice was not necessarily equitable. Rights varied based on an individual's status as a landowning free citizen, a civil servant, or a slave.
If you, as a citizen, kill a slave, you might get away with just paying a fine. If you kill another citizen, you most likely are going to be killed for that yourself. So certainly in the old Babylonian period, not all animals were equal.
The articulation of law by Hammurabi was not the first time people in Mesopotamia were given a code to live by. But Hammurabi's effort was the most comprehensive and sophisticated. Following Hammurabi's reign, southern Mesopotamia became known as Babylonia, a unified kingdom. And Babylon became Mesopotamia's political, cultural, and religious center.
So it was really Hammurabi's doing that made Babylon what it was and what it would be under the Neo-Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar, when it was this great, huge metropolis of the ancient world.
In 1750 BC, illness compelled Hammurabi to surrender the throne to his son. By 1000 BC, Babylon had established a lasting national state in the south. Meanwhile, the city of Ashur dominated a similar rival state, Assyria, in the north. Soon, the region's rulers, like its desert sands, would undergo a remarkable shift. Babylonia will compete for power against North Mesopotamia, home to the ancient world's fiercest fighting machine, the Assyrians.
The empires were getting bigger and bigger and more ruthless.
You are watching The Kings from Babylon to Baghdad, here on the History Channel. The Assyrians, a Semitic people, had inhabited North Mesopotamia for at least 4,000 years. By the 9th century BC, their conquests extended far beyond Ashur, the capital city and heartland of Assyria. From 885 to 860 BC, Assyrian king Ashur-nazir-pal II was intensely focused on military matters.
He wants to build up the power of Assyria. It had previously, several hundred years earlier, had been a major power. And Ashur-nazir-pal seems to have been determined to reinstate it as a major power. And the whole emphasis of the administration is on military matters.
Ashur-nazir-pal's campaign set a standard for the future warrior kings of Assyria, who were ruthless, determined empire builders.
The reliefs that are carved into the walls of the palaces of the Assyrian kings show siege engines ripping apart the walls of enemy cities. We see warships with battering rams on them. We see chariots. We see cavalry. We see infantry digging tunnels underneath the walls of the cities that they're besieging. The empires were getting bigger and bigger and more ruthless.
The sadistic cruelty Ashurnasirpal inflicted on war captives and his own subjects protesting taxation was legendary.
He would make a point of being as brutal as possible. He describes in gruesome detail flaying people, putting their skins on the wall of the city, making pillars of decapitated heads. Really horrible, gruesome stuff. According to scholars, he probably didn't do it everywhere. He would take one city and do it as an example and terrify everyone else into obeying.
By the time of Ashurnasirpal's death in 860 BC, his kingdom extended north to the borders of modern eastern Turkey and to the Mediterranean Sea. In the century following his reign, a lust to control Babylonia dominated the Assyrian monarchy.
The Assyrian kings wanted to be king of the 4 quarters of the universe, or they wanted to be king of everything. Now, they didn't know how big the world was. Everything was them and Babylonia. And if Babylonia was outside of that, then they weren't king of the 4 quarters of the universe. So they needed, I think, perhaps to feel they controlled it.
But the Babylonians, it seemed, had their own ideas about how they wanted to live.
Babylonia refused to buy into Assyria as its overlord, and so was constantly breaking away. And Assyria tried a number of different things. They would put their own Babylonian king on, they would put the son of the Assyrian king on, the Assyrian king themselves would be the king.
Still, no matter what trouble was brewing between the two cultures, the Assyrians, ironically, always held the Babylonian civilization in high regard.
Even though the Assyrians were all-powerful, they still had a sense of cultural inferiority vis-a-vis Babylonia. They saw Babylonia as the source of the best tablets, real cuneiform culture, much as in the 19th century Americans might have looked to England as, you know, the place where you would find real English literature and drama and such.
The Assyrians also felt a strong bond with the Babylonians.
They spoke the same language, they worshipped the same gods, they wore the same clothes. This was a sister culture, but it was a much older sister culture, and it was one that they had tremendous respect for.
But that changed beginning in 704 BC with the reign of the Assyrian king Sennacherib. His army marched south several times to put down revolts in Babylonia.
He initially set up a puppet king, and that puppet king was removed. And then he put his crown prince on the throne of Babylon. This was his loved son. He was his eldest son. It was the man who was going to become king of Assyria after him. He was doing the Babylonians, presumably he thought, a great favor by blessing them with his son.
In 688 BC, Sennacherib's son, Ashur-nadin-shumi, was captured and killed by an invading army. Sennacherib blamed the Babylonians for failing to protect and defend him.
His relationship with the Babylonians got worse and worse. And in the end, he did what was unthinkable in a way, which was to go in and besiege Babylon. And he was brutal to it.
I pressed upon the enemy like the onset of a raging storm. I decimated the enemy host with arrow and spear. All their bodies I bored through like a sieve. I cut their throats like lambs.
He destroyed the city. He burned down buildings, he razed temples. took the statues of gods and had his soldiers destroy them. Now, this is complete desecration. It's sacrilege. Then he cursed the city. He said, no one can rebuild Babylon for 70 years.
Sennacherib's actions angered the Assyrians, who believed Babylon's destruction invited the gods' wrath. Even the king's own family disliked him.
He was killed by his own son. And there are two stories about how he died. One was that he was stabbed, and the other one was that the son took one of those enormous statues of a bull and toppled it on his father. So he was crushed underneath this heavy, heavy stone sculpture. What a horrible way to go.
Upon Sennacherib's death, his youngest son, Esarhaddon, became king of Assyria in 680 BC. Immediately, he wanted to rebuild Babylon and correct the huge mistake he believed his father had made. Yet he knew he would not outlive the 70-year curse recorded for posterity on a clay tablet. Desperate, Esarhaddon consulted the priests and made a startling discovery.
He discovered it wasn't 70 years after all, that they had been reading the tablet upside down. And in fact, it was 11 years, because in the way that numbers are written in cuneiform, 70, if you turn it upside down, is 11. And there it is. All they had to wait was 11 years.
Esarhaddon ordered the city rebuilt. He used the spoils from his conquests to help finance the construction. When Esarhaddon died in 669 BC, he left his eldest son, Ashurbanipal, a kingdom that stretched from Egypt to Persia. Ashurbanipal was one of Mesopotamia's most cultured rulers and claimed a unique skill.
He said, I, Ashurbanipal, who can read and write, and he wanted to have a collection of all the literary works in his kingdom, and he wanted it to be in his palace at Nineveh.
Ashurbanipal began sending agents to search out cuneiform tablets in the archives and schools of the Babylonian temples. His scribes then meticulously copied and cataloged some 20,000 of them before they were housed in what was the world's first library. Among the entire collection, though, Ashurbanipal especially valued more than 300 omen texts that he believed predicted the future.
If the constellation Aries is faint, the king will encounter misery. If the stars of Orion sparkle, someone influential will get too much power and commit evil deeds.
Most of the tablets had to do with the kinds of omen divination that was important for him if he was to rule properly in accord with the will of the gods and really survive as king.
Ashurbanipal was not only a scholar, but also a military leader. Under his command, the Assyrian Empire controlled the entire Near East, the greatest land area ever in Assyrian rule.
So for them, that was the universe, that was everything.
But after Ashurbanipal's death in 627 BC, new power brokers would deliver crushing blows to the Assyrian Empire.
These guys are forming a pincers attack on the Assyrian heartland.
You are watching The Kings, from Babylon to Baghdad, here on the History Channel. Late in the 7th century BC, Babylon was in chaos. Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian king who also reigned over Babylon, had died.
In the ancient Near East, as soon as one king died, everybody tried to break away, thinking that there would be a moment of weakness in the empire. And that's when you have a bit of chaos, because everybody wants a piece of the throne.
In 627 BC, a local leader of uncertain origin named Nabopolassar began vying for Babylon's throne.
He seems to have been a governor of Babylonia. And in the first millennium, you have a number of different ethnic groups in Babylon and Babylonia, and he is in charge of one of them. He seems to have won these skirmishes and claimed the King of Babylon title.
Professing to be a man of the people, King Nabopolassar was determined to win South Mesopotamia's independence from the north. In 626 BC, he began waging war against Babylonia's Assyrian administration. Within 10 years, Nabopolassar had solidified his control over Babylonia, and then began to threaten the Assyrian heartland.
He starts ejecting the Assyrian garrisons and then pushing north into Assyria proper. By 615, he's operating with armies in Assyria itself. And he's joined there by people pushing in from northern Iran, principally Medes. So either operating independently or in concert, these guys are forming a pincers attack on the Assyrian heartland.
In 614 BC, the Medes sacked the city of Nimrud, and a year later brought down Ashur, the spiritual and cultural center of Assyria. In 612, a coalition of Medes and Babylonians marched against Nineveh, and after a 3-month siege, Nineveh fell. The once mighty Assyrian Empire was finished.
Assyria essentially falls victim to its own drive towards maximization, towards conquering. It's not a country whose power is necessarily based on treaties. And as soon as Assyria's power wanes, it basically stands alone and it falls apart.
Nabopolassar's hard-won victory against his city's ages-old rival was sweet.
They slaughtered the land of Assyria. They turned the hostile land into heaps and ruins. The Assyrian, who since distant days had ruled over all the peoples, and with his heavy yoke had brought injury to the people of the land. His feet from Akkad I turned back, and his yoke I threw off.
In 605 BC, Nabopolassar died and was succeeded as king of Babylon by his eldest son, Nebuchadnezzar II. He had served as commander of his father's army and soon proved to be the equal of all the great Mesopotamian conquerors, from Sargon onward.
He managed to reign for more than 40 years, in the course of which he established Babylonian control over much of the western territories of the former Assyrian Empire.
Included in Nebuchadnezzar's empire was the kingdom of Judah. In 600 BC, the king, Jehoiakim, made a fateful decision not to pay annual tribute to Babylon. In revenge, Nebuchadnezzar marched west in December 598 BC and attacked Jerusalem, Judah's capital and the spiritual center of the Jewish people. In a battle lasting 3 months, the Babylonian army was victorious. Nebuchadnezzar ordered what is known in Jewish history as the exile, the deportation to Babylon of thousands of Jews, including the king and his family.
One of the ways of stabilizing a conquered territory was to take a political elite and a social elite that had not proved reliable or cooperative and replace them with a new population of people who had no ties to the place.
Nebuchadnezzar had acquired an empire comparable to that of Assyria. Like the Assyrian kings, he devoted much of the empire's resources to refurbishing and enlarging his capital city, so that it became the largest metropolis in the ancient world.
Those are really efforts that could go into the Guinness Book of Records. The excavator of Babylon estimates that Nebuchadnezzar actually used about 15 million baked bricks in his refurbishment projects of his city.
Apparently, Nebuchadnezzar was a perfectionist. The ceremonial Ishtar Gate, with its depiction of mythological animals, was rebuilt 3 times. Lions on the gate represent the goddess Ishtar, while a demon, called a Mushushu, signifies Marduk, Babylon's principal god and head of the Mesopotamian pantheon.
From Hammurabi's Taiwan, Marduk is one of the great gods of the Near East. He's not the god of anything in particular, but he managed to conquer the evil goddess, whose name was Tiamat. She was the goddess of the sea. And he takes her body and he splits it in 2. And with the upper part, he creates the heavens, and with the lower part, he creates the earth.
The Ishtar Gate stood at the end of the processional way that led to Babylon's temples and ziggurat, the 650-foot tall temple tower known as the Tower of Babel.
Ziggurats throughout Mesopotamian history, they're a sign of religious architecture. They're massive structures. They take a lot of man-hours to build. Only a king with power and wealth can initiate such a project and finish it. And the reasoning behind building the Tower of Babel seems to be personal glory as well.
Within Nebuchadnezzar's magnificent palace were hanging gardens. They were reported by the Greek historian Herodotus to have been one of the world's great wonders. The gardens were supposedly constructed for the king's wife, a homesick Iranian princess who was comforted by the terraced buildings and exotic plants. However, the hanging gardens of Babylon may be nothing more than a myth.
Unfortunately, in Mesopotamian sources, we have really no indication of any such thing. On the other hand, it is true that one of the things that a good Mesopotamian king did was cultivate royal gardens in which you could display plants and animals from the empire. This was one of the ways of showing the scale and range of conquest, and therefore giving a kind of living, breathing, green image of power.
Nebuchadnezzar died at the age of 84 in 562 BC. During his reign, Babylon's arts, sciences, and literature flourished under considerable wealth and strong state support. But all was not perfect beneath the shining surface. Next, Babylon comes under the control of a king loyal to the enemy. You are watching The Kings, from Babylon to Baghdad, here on the History Channel. In June 556 BC, a commoner named Nabonidus became king of Babylon in the aftermath of a bloody coup. He was immediately unpopular with Babylon's priests and people. Not only did he claim to have been a loyal subject of the city's old nemesis, Assyria, but he also ignored Babylon's principal god, Marduk, in favor of the god of his mother.
Nabonidus is very much close to his mother, who seems to be a priestess dedicated to the god Sin, the moon god.
In 549 BC, Nabonidus did the unthinkable. He left his son Belshazzar in charge, and for a decade abandoned Babylon to build and restore temples devoted to the moon god in Tema in southern Arabia and Haran in North Mesopotamia.
The people in Babylon are quite unhappy with Nabonidus because they feel like he has forsaken them.
Belshazzar failed to take seriously a looming threat: Persian imperialism. The Achaemenid dynasty in southwestern Iran was becoming the dominant force in the Near East. They owed their success to rigorous military training.
Persian boys had to learn how to ride horses well as the art of archery. And so in these two military tactics, the Persians were quite good.
In 559 BC, a new king ascended the Achaemenid throne who had a quality not usually found in a conqueror: tolerance. His name was Cyrus the Great. In 10 years, he became famous not only for his military prowess, but also for a bloodless victory against the Iranian Medes.
He is going to take on this amazing campaign of first conquering the Iranian plateau, which was ruled by the Medes. Before the battle, a large number of the Median contingent, their forces actually come to Cyrus and desert the Median ruler. And hence, he's victor before even the battle begins.
By 546 BC, Cyrus had amassed a vast empire, stretching from Asia Minor in the west to the Iranian plateau in the east. All that was left was Babylon, Mesopotamia's political, cultural, and religious center, and Babylonian territories in Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. Conquering them would mean the birth of a new world empire, a feat Cyrus couldn't resist.
Babylon is the center of the world, the capital of the world at this time. Once Cyrus steps into Babylonia and the city of Babylon, he pretty much has changed world history. You are now the master of the capital of the world. Now he's going to descend upon Babylonia.
In 539 BC, Nabonidus returned to save his kingdom, but he was too late. The Persians killed Belshazzar, captured Nabonidus, and then took Babylon without any resistance. The Babylonians were tired of their absent king and welcomed Cyrus not as a conqueror, but as a liberator.
Green twigs are placed before his feet. A state of peace is imposed into the city. One of the first things that he does is to go to the temple of Marduk to perform the rites and rituals which Nabonidus had forsaken.
Nabonidus was exiled to central Iran, where he was given a government post as part of a Persian policy of amnesty. Cyrus took the title King of Babylon and King of the Lands. By pursuing a policy of generosity instead of repression, and by favoring the local religion, he was able to make enthusiastic supporters of his new subjects. Cyrus also reached out to Babylon's Jewish population, and in 537 BC, he let 40,000 exiles return to Palestine. The Jews considered him a savior who delivered them from 60 years of captivity. Under the rule of the Achaemenid Persian kings, southern Mesopotamia flourished for some 200 years. Babylon remained the economic center of the empire and was the winter residence of the Persian court. Yet by the time of Darius III in 336 BC, ineffective rulers and multiple rebellions had steadily weakened the Persian Empire. Within 5 years, Darius, at age 50, was forced to defend Babylon against the 22-year-old king of the Macedonians, Alexander the Great.
The Persian king offered him the western half of the empire and offered to make him his son-in-law. And Alexander said, "No, half isn't good enough. I want the whole thing."
The stakes were high for Darius. Losing Babylonia would most likely mean the end of the Persian Empire.
The issue for the Persians is that if they relinquish Mesopotamia, the Iranian plateau lays open to Alexander. And so Darius has to make his stand in Babylonia. This battle is so very important for the Persians to win.
October 331 BC. Darius and Alexander squared off at Gaugamela in North Mesopotamia. Darius remained confident.
It's the Persians who actually picked the battlefield. And according to the Greek accounts, they even prepared the battlefield as well as they could for advantage to their own forces. It's a fairly wide open valley, a wide plain that was picked because it was suitable for them to use chariotry.
Darius's secret weapon, in fact, was a new chariot that he believed would give him a greater advantage.
It is very heavy chariots that had attached to their wheels blades, rotating blades, that were supposed to be such fearsome juggernauts that they would break the line of the infantry opposing them and create enough disorder in the center of the army that the whole formation would fall apart.
But Darius underestimated Alexander, who had his own surprise in store.
His infantry forces, they'd been practicing to deal with this for quite some time. And when these scythe chariots approached, they stepped aside. The chariots went through, they turned around and basically butchered the chariot crews with spears and axes from behind. And that's the hammer against the anvil, attack the main force from behind.
After nearly 1 day of fighting, Darius fled the battlefield in a cloud of dust. And Alexander took possession of Babylonia. He had great plans for it.
Babylonia was going to be the center of the empire that he was making. He already began some building projects there. He sent out a fleet to explore the Red Sea. He began building naval installations along the Tigris and Euphrates and down near the mouth of the Gulf to make the cities farther up in Iraq more accessible to navigation.
Alexander's plans were never completed. In June 323 BC, during a stay in Babylon at Nebuchadnezzar's old palace, the 33-year-old king became sick with a fever and died of uncertain causes. After Alexander's death, his empire was divided by the generals who had fought by his side. Political power shifted from Babylon to the new city of Seleucia on the west bank of the Tigris River in Mesopotamia.
Babylonia wasn't the capital of an empire anymore. And now it's not the capital of the territory anymore either. So there is a decline that begins then, but it probably takes quite a while before it really has a serious effect on turning Babylon into a kind of desolate village.
Today, the remains of Babylon are spread out over a cluster of mounds or tells located on the Euphrates, some 60 miles southwest of Baghdad. In the next 900 years, Mesopotamia was ruled by a series of Greek and Persian dynasties. But one conquest would prove decisive in shaping the identity of what would become the country of Iraq.
Any effort that you expend to spread Islam in the world, to make yourself a better Muslim, to improve the situation of Muslims is considered to be jihad.
You are watching The Kings, from Babylon to Baghdad, here on the History Channel. By the 7th century AD, for more than 400 years, Mesopotamia had been part of an empire built by a Persian dynasty, the Sasanians. In fact, it was right in the middle of the Sasanians' vast territory that extended from India and Turkey to Iran, Syria, and the Red Sea. But by 634 AD, the Sasanians' domination began to be challenged by an Arab army. As Muslims, the Arabs followed a religion called Islam and believed that fighting the Sasanians was a service to God.
The word that's used for service is the word jihad. Jihad is normally translated in today's discourse as holy war. In fact, it means effort. So any effort that you expend to spread Islam in the world, to make yourself a better Muslim, to improve the situation of Muslims is considered to be jihad, is considered to be effort in God's path.
According to Islamic tradition, the Prophet Muhammad is the messenger of God, or Allah. To avoid idolatry, no images of him are allowed. A merchant from the city of Mecca, Muhammad grew disillusioned with business practices early in the 7th century.
The rise of commercialism had brought about a neglect of the poor and the orphaned, as he called them. And he began to retire into caves that surrounded Mecca. And there, in the year 612, he had heard voices. He became convinced that this was the voice of the archangel Gabriel, who was informing him that God has chosen him to be a messenger.
By the time Muhammad died in 632, he had set in motion a great religious movement and an awe-inspiring military machine to take Islam beyond Arabia. 636 AD, the Sasanian and Arab armies faced off at Al-Qadisiyah, a village south of the hamlet of Baghdad on the Euphrates River, under the leadership of their most brilliant commander, Rustam. The Sasanians mobilized a huge force of 120,000 men. With an army of just 4,000, the Arabs were outnumbered 30 to 1. But the belief that Allah was on their side gave them strength. The Arab leader, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, shouted, "God is most great," and ordered his troops to attack. But they were no match for the Sasanian army's tanks, an elephant corps that wrought havoc in the Arab ranks.
Didn't know how to deal with it. It was just riding all over everybody. And eventually they found out a way of tackling the elephant, and that is to attack it at its trunk. And a war cry went through the camp, "Strike the elephant at the trunk, strike the elephant at the trunk." And they began to do that. That's really what made the battle.
By the end of the 4th day of bloody fighting, 30,000 men were dead. And Rustam was slain as he tried to flee. Confused and panicked, the Sasanian troops broke rank and ran off. The Arab underdogs were victorious, and the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah sealed the fate of the Sasanian Empire.
The backbone of the Persian Empire was broken. Its main army was defeated in that battle. And it opened up areas for Arab Islamic conquest.
One of the things that the Arabs do pretty early on, in fact, a couple of years after the Battle of Qadisiyah, is establish two important camp cities in that area. One, Kufa, and the other, of course, we know much better as Basra today. These were cities that were designed to house the Arab fighters and not let them mix with the local population.
By the mid-7th century, the Arabs controlled Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau up to Central Asia. Some historians believe that by this time, Mesopotamia was referred to as Iraq.
There's a disagreement about this among historians. A minority view holds that the name probably is derived from the ancient Sumerian city-state of Uruk. And a more accepted version is that the name is derived from a Semitic word which refers to a shoreline in reference to the river.
By 661 AD, a disagreement over how Islamic leaders should be chosen had been developing between Islam's first ruling dynasty, the Umayyads, and a minority Muslim faction in southern Iraq. A wealthy clan, the Umayyads, moved the capital of Islam from Medina in Arabia to Damascus and used the Syrian army to extend the Arab Empire. The Umayyads would become Sunni Muslims, whose leaders, or caliphs, were selected by community elders. However, the devoutly religious community in Iraq, known as Shiite Muslims, did not recognize the authority of the Umayyad caliphs. Rather, they accepted the descendants of Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, Ali, as the only legitimate leaders.
They came to argue that Ali and his descendants were divinely inspired and chosen by God to be the leaders of the Muslim community. These divinely inspired individuals, they refer to as imams.
Over the next 20 years, the followers of Ali, known as Shi'at Ali, fought against the Umayyads for control of the empire. Though unsuccessful, the Shia would remain a powerful oppositional force in Iraq. It was another dynasty of Sunni Muslims that finally overthrew the Umayyads in 750 AD. The Abbasids were descendants of Muhammad's uncle Abbas, and like the Shia, believed the spirit of Islam had been betrayed by the Umayyads. In 762, the Abbasids chose a small Iraqi village as the new heart of the Muslim world, Baghdad.
It was easy to reach it by caravan. And it was situated on the west bank of the Tigris, just to the east of the Euphrates, which means it was almost surrounded by water and thus more easily defensible.
A labor crew of 100,000 transformed Baghdad into a bustling metropolis in just 4 years. By the end of the 8th century, Baghdad was the wealthiest, most opulent, and intellectual city in Islam. Over the next 3 centuries, however, the capital of Islam suffered through the political turmoil of a civil war and a series of natural disasters, including fires and floods. But the worst was yet to come, when one of the world's most powerful military forces began heading straight for Baghdad.
The extent of the destruction is one that remains very much in the consciousness of Iraqis today, believe it or not.
You are watching The Kings, from Babylon to Baghdad, here on the History Channel. Early in the 13th century, a fierce warrior, Genghis Khan, organized a nearly invincible army of nomadic Mongols from Central Asia. He began the conquest of an enormous territory that would be completed by his sons and grandsons. In 1257, one grandson, Hulagu, targeted for conquest the capital of the Islamic Empire, Baghdad.
The chief religious tradition among the Mongols was various forms of shamanism. And Hulagu at various times mentions that one of his missions is to destroy Islam.
Hulagu demanded Baghdad's submission from the 37th Abbasid Caliph, al-Mustasim.
I will burn your city, your land, yourself. If you wish to spare yourself and your venerable family, give heed to my advice with the ear of intelligence. If you do not, you will see what God has willed.
The Caliph responded by saying, "You daren't attack me, because if you attack me, the entire Muslim world will come to my support." As it turned out, the Muslim world did nothing, and Baghdad faced its most terrible calamity under the Mongols.
In January 1258, Hulagu led an army of 70,000 to Baghdad. After some 30 days of fighting, Baghdad fell. And Hulagu made good on his earlier threat. He killed the Caliph by wrapping him in a rug and having him either trampled by horses or beaten to a pulp. An eyewitness recounted what Hulagu's army did next.
They swept through the city like hungry falcons attacking a flight of doves. Or like raging wolves attacking sheep. With loose rein and shameless faces, murdering and spreading fear.
Probably about 100,000 people were put to the sword in several weeks of looting. The great libraries of Baghdad were intentionally destroyed. Most of their books were dumped in the river.
Legend has it that the Tigris River first ran red with blood and then black with ink.
It was a terrible massacre, and the extent of the destruction is one that remains very much in the consciousness of Iraqis today, believe it or not. For Iraqis, the very name of Hulagu brings images of destruction and fear.
Hulagu died in 1265. But his dynasty, known as the Ilkhanids, ruled the territory of Iraq, eastern Anatolia, the Caucasus, and Iran from the Iranian city of Tabriz. Damaging effects of the Mongol invasion continued to resonate in Iraq for over 2 centuries.
Iraq is a scene of devastation, constant invasions, instability, and generally economic decline. These are the dark ages of Iraq in all respects, really.
The Mongols were unable to maintain control over Iraq after the death of the last Il-Khan ruler in 1357. The region languished, mainly under a series of local strongmen, until the 16th century, when Iraq became a religious battleground between two neighboring empires, the Persian Safavids and the Turkic Ottomans. The Ottomans, who were Sunni Muslims, had created an empire by raiding Christian territory under Byzantine control, which they considered their duty, a jihad. The Ottomans renamed the Byzantine capital of Constantinople as Istanbul when they conquered it in 1453.
The Ottomans were the greatest military machine of the late Middle Ages and the early modern period even. They were the ones to introduce muskets for their infantry. And the Ottoman armies proved to be invincible, really.
Beginning in 1520 with the reign of the 10th Sultan, a brilliant military strategist known in the West as Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire reached its zenith and became a world power. The Safavid dynasty was founded by Shah Ismail in 1499. The Safavid state provided the territorial and societal foundations of modern Iran.
They started out as being a mystical Muslim community in the mountains of Azerbaijan. Eventually they would adopt Shia Islam and became fervent Shia Muslims. Under Shah Ismail, who was the first ruler of the Safavid Empire, Shia Islam was imposed upon the population of the conquered areas.
Shah Ismail invaded Iraq in 1508, in part to take control of its two holiest Shiite cities, An-Najaf and Karbala. Sultan Suleiman considered himself the supreme caliph of Islam, and so not only sought Ottoman control of Iraq for commercial reasons, but for religious ones as well.
They needed to conquer it, not only to defeat the Shia Persians and acquire legitimacy as Sunnis, but Iraq also represented for Suleiman the Magnificent the seat of the Abbasid Empire. For him, by conquering Iraq, he was resurrecting this Abbasid Empire. He viewed himself as the inheritor of the legacy of the Abbasids.
Suleiman began his conquest of Iraq in 1533. Surprisingly, by 1534, he captured the former Abbasid capital of Baghdad without a fight.
Baghdad surrendered quite easily to the Ottomans. Sunni scholars go out to Suleiman and they give him the keys of the city, saying, please take it over. We have been subjected to this persecution by the Safavids and we need you to take it over.
Despite Suleiman's victory in Baghdad, the Ottomans and Safavids continued to battle for control of Iraq long after the Sultan's death in 1566. The Safavids finally were driven out for good in 1638, and Iraq became part of the Ottoman Empire. But over the next 2 centuries, Suleiman's descendants found the region difficult to govern.
It was a very fractured society. Tribalism was very strong in many parts, and in fact most people were either rural or tribal. The cities were small and few, and the Ottomans governed through a rather thin administration, mainly of Ottoman Turks, but with some Arabs as well. And it was Islam, the belief in Islam, Islamic institutions and so on that held it together.
Early in the 19th century, the Ottomans imposed central authority over the region. They divided it into 3 administrative districts that would become the forerunner of modern Iraq: Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra. In fact, Basra, near Iraq's only access to the Persian Gulf, was quickly growing into a center for international trade. At the dawn of the 20th century, the Ottomans would have to contend with foreigners who had an eye on their wealth.
Everybody knew that sooner or later they were going to find oil across the border in what was then Ottoman Iraq.
You are watching The Kings, from Babylon to Baghdad, here on the History Channel. In 1908, crude oil was discovered in Iran. Winston Churchill, Britain's civilian head of the Royal Navy, was convinced that oil, not coal, was the fuel of the future. In 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was formed to develop the new industry.
Everybody knew that sooner or later they were going to find oil across the border in what was then Ottoman Iraq. British investments increased, British presence increased, and already there were well-detailed plans to conquer at least the southern part of the country prior to World War I.
On August 1st, 1914, Germany, motivated by a desire for greater power and international influence, declared war on Russia. World War I was set in motion. When the Ottoman Empire sided with Germany and Austria-Hungary against the Allies, the British found their commercial interests in the Middle East suddenly threatened. By November 1914, the British Army occupied Basra to defend the Anglo-Persian Oil Company's fields and refineries nearby in Iran. Beginning in 1916, the British engaged in a series of offenses that eventually led to the capture of Baghdad. They entered the city on March 11, 1917, under Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Stanley Maude. 9,000 Turkish soldiers surrendered rather than put up a fight. General Maude announced to the people of Baghdad,
"Our armies do not come into your cities and lands as conquerors or enemies, but as liberators."
The British Army continued to move north until it captured Mosul early in November 1918. Britain then controlled nearly all of Iraq. The Ottoman Turks were defeated. Iraqis and Arabs from other Ottoman provinces in the Middle East hoped their long-held dream of self-rule would finally come true.
An Arab nationalist movement of sorts had already started before World War I. And many of the Arab army officers and civil servants and intellectuals who had been, some of them educated in Istanbul, were opposed to control by the Turks.
At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, Arab hopes for independence were crushed when the Ottoman provinces were divided between France and Britain by the League of Nations. Iraq, as well as Palestine, became a mandate entrusted to Britain.
These countries were deemed to be almost ready for independence, but they were going to need help from foreign powers to prepare them for independence. Nation building, we call it today.
Arnold Wilson was the administrator in charge of the Iraq Mandate.
He argued that it was in British interest to bring civilization to Iraq, to Mesopotamia, and that this could only be done through direct English rule over the country. Thus, he brushed aside any claims of Iraqis to participate in the governance of the country.
Enraged at being shut out of the new government, 100,000 armed Iraqis revolted in July 1920.
In the Iraqi view, of course, this is the first national rebellion against British colonialism.
It took the British 3 months to crush the rebellion. By 1921, Colonial Secretary Winston Churchill was determined to end direct British rule and install a British-friendly Arab leader as King of Iraq. He invited Prince Faisal al-Hussein to become ruler of the new state, even though he was not Iraqi, but was instead a member of the Hashemites, the ruling family of Mecca.
Faisal was a descendant of the Prophet, and thus he had sort of religious credentials. He had Arab nationalist credentials in the sense that he was a leader of a revolt against the Ottomans in the name of Arabism. Generally speaking, he was considered to be quite moderate and willing to accommodate British interest.
In August 1921, Faisal was elected King of Iraq in a dubious referendum. The Hashemite monarchy was considered as foreign by many Iraqis.
The real problem here was the monarchy was seen as sort of a tool of the British, and it was the mandate itself that generated the opposition.
British control could not prevent King Faisal from leading Iraq toward greater freedom. At the king's urging, Iraq was admitted to the League of Nations as an independent state in October 1932. By the late 1940s, many Iraqis were dissatisfied with the pro-British monarchy, which was growing increasingly alienated from society.
Peasants were being driven off the land because they couldn't pay the loans that they had borrowed. So landlessness was increasing. The situation in the countryside was one of intense poverty.
Oil accentuated the class division. It had been discovered in the city of Kirkuk in 1927.
It allowed the government to enjoy a source of wealth that was not dependent on society. It didn't have to pay any attention to taxpayers and their wishes. There was the entire budget of the Iraqi government right from the ground, so it was not accountable to anybody, and this caused it to grow in arrogance and in isolation.
Inequality and social misery intensified Arab nationalist and anti-Western sentiments.
You get the rise of ideologies, and more specifically Marxism, Leninism, that begins to influence those people who are struggling against colonialism and imperial control.
The Iraqi monarchy clung to the past. On May 2nd, 1953, 18-year-old Faisal II assumed the throne.
Surrounded by senators, deputies, and members of foreign delegations, he took the oath of kingship.
In 1956, Iraq joined the Baghdad Pact, an anti-communist security alliance that included Great Britain, Turkey, Pakistan, and Iran. That same year, King Faisal affirmed his government's friendship with Britain. Two years later, the king would be assassinated.
Once you uncork the bottle, all sorts of things come out.
You are watching The Kings, from Babylon to Baghdad, here on the History Channel. By the late 1950s, a strong nationalist sentiment pervaded Iraq. Determined to end the monarchy, a military group called the Free Officers Association launched a coup on July 14, 1958.
Explosive news from the Middle East. A military coup and mob revolt in Iraq topples King Faisal from the throne.
It was over in just a few hours. A bloody massacre at Al-Zuhur Palace left 23-year-old King Faisal dead.
They tore him to pieces, they mutilated his body, they cut his feet off, they cut his head off, his hands, and then they hanged him for everyone to see.
The 1958 revolution was quite violent. It wasn't meant to be. The officers that conducted it wanted to get rid of the ruling family, and the ruling family was killed. But as frequently happens, once you uncork the bottle, all sorts of things come out.
The leader of the revolution, General Abdul Karim Qasim, became Prime Minister of the new Republic of Iraq.
Our revolution is a real reaction against tyranny and corruption. Our foreign policy is to work for peace and cooperate with the other nations. We are friendly to all peace-loving nations on the basis of mutual interest.
Some of Qasim's progressive laws that promoted women's rights and land reform were considered too radical by a number of Iraqis. They began to support the right-wing Ba'ath Party that emerged in Iraq in the early 1950s.
All the forces that feared the leftist tide in Iraq gravitated toward the most militant, the most organized, the most vicious of the right-wing groups, which was the Ba'ath Party.
The storied city of Baghdad, capital of Iraq, has been the scene once more of bloody revolt that has seated a new government.
On February 8, 1963, a coalition force of Baathists and Arab nationalist army officers staged a bloody coup to overthrow Qasim. "24 hours later, he was executed. A former collaborator of Qasim in the 1958 revolution, Colonel Abdul Salam Arif, assumed the presidency. Following the coup, Arif and his Arab nationalist supporters in the army outmaneuvered the Ba'aths to take complete control of the government. But the Ba'ath Party did not go away. In fact, it grew stronger by recruiting new members and extending its reach deeper into the core of elite army officers.
The man who was responsible for doing this was Saddam Hussein, who was really responsible for organization. including not only the cell structure, but the security organization.
On April 13th, 1966, Arif was killed in a helicopter crash. He was succeeded by his brother, Abdul Rahman, a weak leader, unskilled in military politics. On July 17th, 1968, the Ba'ath Party took advantage of Abdul Rahman's ineffective leadership. The Ba'athists staged a nearly bloodless coup that sent him into exile. 54-year-old General Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr became president of the newly established Revolutionary Command Council, Iraq's supreme executive, legislative, and judicial body. Al-Bakr's vice chairman and second in command was 31-year-old Saddam Hussein.
He was raised by his uncle, who was a staunch Arab nationalist, and who fed him this outlook. We hear stories that he was sort of a village bully, that he carried a pistol around with him, and there are those who say he even killed someone when he was still a child.
Saddam was in charge of internal security, the job of eliminating any opposition to the Ba'ath government and to himself.
For a long time, the Ba'athists depended on elements within the military to stabilize their rule. Saddam built a new base for the party, and this was the secret police. The secret police spread an atmosphere of terror in Iraq, where everybody feared their neighbor, and even parents feared their own children.
During the next 10 years, al-Bakr and Saddam Hussein moved Iraq toward totalitarianism. After a decade of purging, power plays, and consolidation, Saddam had practical control of power within the government. Not surprisingly, al-Bakr stepped down, citing ill health. On July 17, 1979, Saddam stepped to the forefront of Iraqi politics and proclaimed himself the new leader of Iraq.
Saddam Hussein is the absolute ruler, the chief of the party as well as the state, and everything in between. And so with his unilateral rule and unilateral decision making, he really leads the country downhill.
The Iraqi troops stormed across the border and occupied the oil-rich emirate of Kuwait.
Saddam's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990 brought decisive international action and led to the Gulf War in 1991. It ended in defeat and harsh, humiliating ceasefire terms for Iraq. Over the next 12 years, Iraqis endured economic sanctions, weapons inspections, and airstrikes.
Iraq under Saddam had the greatest potential. It is a very wealthy country, had a lot of resources, and it was forced to be underdeveloped economically and everything else after the sanctions were imposed after the Gulf War.
Saddam remained defiant.
This is a regime that has something to hide from the civilized world.
By 2002, many in the U.S. government believed that the Iraqi leader had hidden weapons of mass destruction somewhere in his country. A U.S.-led military coalition entered Iraq in April 2003, and before the end of the year, Saddam Hussein had been ousted and captured. Iraq has had a long tradition of violent conquest and occupation. From the era of ancient warring city-states to battles over Babylon and Baghdad, and revolt and revolution in more recent times, many have sought control of Iraq.
It's a land that historically has been very wealthy. In the past, agricultural and commercial wealth. In the present, oil wealth. And thus it's constantly invited invasions.
For centuries, Iraqis, indeed their Mesopotamian ancestors, resented or tolerated larger-than-life, power-hungry leaders. The end of Saddam Hussein's brutality and repression has provided an opportunity for change in Iraq. In June 2004, a new Iraqi government took control of the country. As the post-Saddam outcome for Iraq continues to unfold, the vision and leadership of Iraqis will determine how extensive change will be and what direction it will take.